चलिए आपको दुनिया का सैर कराते हैं। 12 ऐसी जगह का पॉपुलेशन कितना है, चलिए जानते हैं इस वीडियो में। किस शहर में है
Nations remain vastly uninhabited.
इस
The
एरिया का
following 12
कितना क्षेत्रफल है, आइए इस वीडियो में जानते हैं। नंबर 12।
is inhabited by a mere 19.94 million residents, giving the nation a population density of just 7.32 people per square. Why does this stunning land full of turquoise lakes, otherworldly deserts, and the last wild apple forest resonate with such solitude, particularly when it's the wealthiest Central Asian nation with a no quality of life? The climate. Endless arid steppe or desert blanket 94% of this land, which receives less than 200 millimeters or 7.5 inches of annual rainfall. And since Kazakhstan is also the largest landlocked country, sitting over 1,700 kilometers from the nearest ocean, it experiences extreme temperatures, seeing both positive to 45 degrees Celsius. This results in very little arable land, mostly located near the mountains to the east, north, and south, where the climate is more temperate. And unsurprisingly, nearly all of Kazakhstan's population resides in these regions. Now, historically, most Kazakhs led nomadic lives as pastoral herders and thus didn't build large settlements. But even so, the population would likely be significantly higher if not for tragic events such as the Kazakh famine. Following the takeover of Kazakhstan by the Soviet Union in 1920, the vast majority of Kazakhs were forcibly relocated to collective grain farms. These districts were then blacklisted from trading or receiving food and aid unless they met their quotas. And since it isn't suitable for sedentary farming, crops often failed, resulting in 90% of livestock perishing and the starvation of 1.5 to 2.3 million Kazakhs from 1930 to 1933, which was more than half the population at the time. The Soviets conducted nearly 500 nuclear tests in the country, affecting an additional 1.5 million Kazakhs with nuclear fallout. Number 11. Mauritania. At 1.03 million square kilometers, Mauritania is 3 times the size of just 4.86 million, is smaller than Metro Berlin. And although the largest amount of modern-day slavery is a reason it's one of the least visited countries, with less than 2,000 visitors each year, the main reason it's so sparsely populated with just 4.72 people per square kilometer is water, or rather, the lack thereof. Mauritania is the 7th driest country with just 89 millimeters or 3.5 inches of annual rainfall. This is due to 90% of its land being blanketed by the Sahara Desert, one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth. To make matters worse, severe drought since the 1960s has caused the desert to expand at a rate of 6 kilometers per year, exacerbating the issues. Because the population is concentrated in the coastal cities of Nouakchott and Nouadhibou, or on the southern border along the Senegal River, the country's sole permanent water source and where all 0.5% of the nation's arable land is. But not only does literally no one live in the vast majority of the country, the central and eastern parts are completely inaccessible. In fact, there are only 3,700 kilometers of road in the entire country. That's less than in Washington, D.C. But who needs roads when you can hitch a cold, grime-covered 717-kilometer ride on the iron ore train? Yeah, I don't really get with more elephants than anywhere on Earth. Less than 2.7 million people call Botswana home. Your initial assumption might attribute the modest population to national parks covering 40% of the nation and the Kalahari Desert 70%, but that doesn't tell the full story. Botswana's desert is technically semi-arid rather than a true desert, with even the driest parts receiving around 300 millimeters or 12 inches of rain per year. And the north and southeastern parts of the country, where most Botswanans live, is actually quite fertile. The biggest cause for the low population density of just 4.6 people per square kilometer is AIDS. Botswana was among the nations hit hardest by the HIV epidemic, with 40% of the population contracting the virus by 2000 and 25 to 30,000 deaths per year. The average life expectancy actually dropped from 63 years in 1987 to just 37 by 2002. And although Botswana's diamond wealth and non-corrupt government made it the first African nation to offer life-saving antiretroviral drugs free to all residents, effectively of lives, the repercussions of the epidemic are still felt today, with 25% of adults still living with the virus and birth rates currently half of what they were in the 1980s. Number 9. Libya. If you thought Mauritania and Botswana were dry, Libya is saying, hold my beer. Well, not literally, since alcohol is banned here, but that's not the only way Libya is dry. Located in the heart of the Sahara Desert, a sea of sand the size of Alaska enshrouds more than 90% of this 1.76 million square kilometer nation. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Libya is the second driest country, with an average annual rainfall of just 56 millimeters or 2.2 inches. And sure, its even drier neighbor, Egypt, houses over 100 million more residents than Libya's 7.25 million. But Egypt also has the Nile, the long world. Libya, in contrast, doesn't have any rivers. In fact, it's only due to historic Mediterranean cities such as Tripoli and Benghazi that Libya's population density is as 1-2 people per square kilometer. Because if it weren't for the country's 8 meters of coastline, where over 90% of Libyans live, and the largest area in the world which pumps water from an aquifer 1,600 kilometers away, it would be by far the emptiest nation. Number 8. Canada. Canada is the second largest country on spanning 9.984 million square kilometers. That's nearly the size of Europe, which houses 750 million people. Canada's population, on the other hand, is a sparse 40.4 million, which translates to remarkably low population density of 4.05 people per square kilometer. Why though? Canada's climate is perfect! Well, maybe for you, Mr. Moose, but for the vast majority is too darn north and too darn cold. It's why 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the US border, and 70% live south of the 49th parallel. And if you're wondering why this vast southern section of Ontario is so sparsely populated, it's the Canadian Shield, an area of exposed that's impossible to grow agriculture on. But even this region would be extremely hot when compared to the 3 territories, which take up nearly 40% of the country. All located north of the 60th parallel, they cover larger than India at 3.92 million square kilometers, yet their total population is 120,000. Yeah, that's a population density of 0.33 people per square kilometer. Less than even Alaska. Number 7. Suriname. While many of the most uninhabitable parts of Africa are due to a lack of water, the most uninhabitable parts of South America have water. And with over 3,000 millimeters or 10 feet of annual rainfall, Suriname is the prime example. Located less than 400 kilometers from the equator, 94% of the country sits inside the Amazon rainforest, making it the most forested nation on Earth. But although its jungle is beautiful with thousands of unique species, it's also extremely hot and humid, full of dangerous critters, and nearly impossible to build, which is why over 90% of Suriname's 632,000 residents live along the coastal plain, with half the population capital, Paramaribo. Even the coast still isn't very hospitable, however, with 2 rainy seasons and extreme flooding every year. In fact, only 0.3% country is considered arable, and even less is developed, with just 1,100 kilometers of paved roads and no roads at all in the interior. where rivers are the main method of transportation. All these factors, combined with a struggling economy, give Suriname one of the highest emigration rates in the world, resulting in a population density of only 3.86 people per kilometer. But hey, at least it's one of the most multicultural nations, and the food is delicious. Number 6, Iceland. Iceland's sparse population density, a mere 3.82 people per square kilometer, isn't solely a consequence of it being an icy, isolated island. Because although its northern location ensures dark, windy winters, Iceland surprisingly boasts milder weather than many bustling metropolises. The real reason the nation houses less residents than Arlington, Texas, a suburb, lies in its fiery heart. Nestled between tectonic plates, Iceland hosts 41 active volcanic systems, which, combined with the mossy canyons, black sand beaches, and majestic waterfalls, makes it a big tourist draw. But an even bigger challenge for building settlements. Catastrophic eruptions, like the Skaftarel, killed over a quarter of the population, have rendered vast areas unlivable. Between the lava fields, glacier, tundra, only 20% of Iceland is actually habitable, and just 1.5% of it is arable, meaning most produce has to either be imported or grown in greenhouses. Due to this and a heavy reliance on the fishing industry, 95% of Iceland's 394,000 residents live along the coast, where the climate is less harsh and the danger of volcanoes less great. Number 5, Guyana. Guyana is South America's lone English-speaking nation, but its disconnect from its Latin neighbors extends beyond just language. Similar to Suriname, 85% of Guyana is engulfed by the Amazon rainforest, rendering urban development exceptionally challenging. In fact, Guyana is the least developed South American country with less than 800 kilometers of paved roads and no roads connecting the eastern and western halves. So although technically on the mainland, in practice, Guyana operates as an island, with lush overgrown jungles separating the 90% of the population who lives along the coast from the rest of the country and world. The nearest major city to Georgetown, the capital, home to half the country's 814,000 residents, is Manaus, Brazil, one of the most remote cities on Earth. And it's still a 1,500 kilometer journey through dangerous unpaved Amazon roads featuring multiple river crossings. To deepen the isolation, there are also no direct flights from Georgetown to any Latin American cities except Panama. It's no wonder Jim Jones built his Jonestown cult here. Nearly the entire country is impossible to access and empty with a population density of only 3.79 people per square kilometer. Now, the discovery of oil has transformed the economy into the fastest growing in recent years, but huge wealth inequality means many Guyanese still live in extreme poverty. As such, anyone with the means emigrates to the US, UK, or Canada, with an estimated 30,000 Guyanese leaving the nation every year. Number 4, Australia. Australia, spanning a vast 7.7 million square kilometers, is nearly the size of the continental United States. However, its population of 26.8 million is smaller than that of Texas alone. Why is this colossal continent country, despite offering an exceptionally high quality of life and stunning scenery, so sparsely populated with just 3.48 people per square kilometer? Well, because the Australian continent seems to have been cursed with the worst luck when it comes to hosting settlements. Not only is it extremely geographically isolated from every other continent, which historically made trade and transportation difficult, the land down under is also the driest inhabited continent, with vast portions of the outback, an arid region covering 70% of the nation, being simply unlivable. Heck, it's even dangerous to drive through the outback, as 50 degrees Celsius isn't unusual, and one could travel thousands of kilometers, while other dry parts of the world have massive rivers that civilizations could grow on, such as the Nile, Tigris, and Euphrates. The Colorado River alone has a greater flow than all of Australia's rivers combined. This is due to Australia being the lowest, flattest continent with no glaciers and very little snowmelt to supply rivers. As if that weren't bad enough, the Australian plate is also the oldest landmass on Earth in severely nutrient-poor soil. Because of this, Australia is one of the most urbanized nations, with over half of its population living in just 3 cities. Meaning if you removed them, Australia would be by far the emptiest nation. Number 3, Namibia. With the tallest sand dunes, wilderness areas full of desert-adapted mammals, and of course, the skeleton coast. Namibia's beautiful and unique countries. But despite its expansive 825,000 square kilometers being twice the size of California, only 2.7 million Namibians reside in the world's third least densely populated nation. What's the reason for its tiny population density of 3.36 people per square kilometer? The Namib Desert. The oldest desert on Earth stretches 1,900 kilometers along the coastline and sees less than 2 millimeters or 0.08 inches of annual rain. But the lack of water isn't the only reason this region is devoid of settlements. Cold currents from Antarctica keep the ocean cool year-round here. And when those frigid waters are met by the hot desert, a near-permanent layer of fog forms up to 100 kilometers inland. This made sailing into Namibia highly hazardous, leading to the wreckage of hundreds of ships that still litter its beaches. In fact, if it weren't for the coast's only decent natural harbor, Walvis Bay, Namibia would function as a landlocked country. And it practically does, with nearly the entire population living at least 200 kilometers inland in the more lush Kalahari Desert. Yeah, remember the least habitable part of Botswana we talked about? That's Namibia's most livable region. Even with no perennial rivers and just 1% arable land, however, Namibia has turned into one of Africa's safest, most stable, and wealthiest nations. Now, before we get to the final two, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. If we hit 5,000 likes, I'll make a video on the largest emptiest regions of the world. And I also wanted to give a quick honorable mention to Greenland, which would be by far the emptiest country if it were considered one, with just 0.026 people per square kilometer. Less than 57,000 people live on the world's largest island, covering 2.17 million square kilometers. Yeah, Greenland is larger than Mexico, yet its population is less than Greenwood, Indiana. And if you've never heard of Greenwood, that's the point. Pick any random US suburb, and there's a good chance it's more populated. Of course, the main reason is extreme weather and inhospitable terrain. 80% of the island is covered by a massive glacier 3 times the size of Texas. As such, 100% of the population lives on the coast. But while Greenland is trying to gain independence, they are still technically a self-governing territory of Denmark, and thus don't qualify for the list. Number 2. Mongolia. 700 years ago, the Mongol Empire housed over 100 million residents and spanned 33 million square kilometers, making it the largest contiguous state to have ever existed and nearly twice the size of Russia, the current largest country. So why is Mongolia, a vast land twice the size of Texas at 1.56 million square kilometers, home to just 3.45 million people today? Well, because a significant portion of those 100 million weren't ethnic Mongols, but rather Cossacks, Uzbeks, Persians, and Arabians who were absorbed by the empire. The area that's modern-day Mongolia has always been sparsely populated. Landlocked on the Mongolian plateau, over 700 kilometers from the nearest ocean, 91% of Mongolia sits on a high-elevation, low-precipitation grassland steppe or desert, and thus experiences extreme temperatures in both directions, particularly enduring brutally long and frigid winters due to Arctic air dropping into the valleys from Siberia to the north. The capital, Ulaanbaatar, is actually the coldest major city on Earth, and a significant portion of the country is affected by discontinuous permafrost, which makes construction and farming incredibly difficult. Consequently, Mongols were traditionally nomadic peoples, and a quarter of the population still lives this way today. But this isn't the sole reason Mongolia is so empty with just 2.21 people per square kilometer. Geopolitical factors have also played a significant role, such as when 1/3 of all Mongol men were Buddhist monks for over 200 years during the Qing dynasty, and thus not allowed to marry or have children. Plus, when Mongolia gained true independence in 1990, many ethnic Mongols lived outside its borders, with 800,000 currently residing in Russia and over 5 million in China. Number 1. Western Sahara. While the UN doesn't recognize Western Sahara's sovereignty, and Morocco is desperately trying to claim the area, 46 countries currently recognize it as the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic and an independent state. So if you do consider Western Sahara to be a country, it's the least densely populated nation with only 2.207 people per square kilometer. The why is similar to its neighbor Mauritania. Nearly the entire country is low, flat desert with no permanent rivers, average annual rainfall under 50 millimeters, and just 0.02% of land considered arable. As such, the indigenous Sahrawi people traditionally led a Bedouin, nomadic way of life. Little economic opportunity and long-standing political conflict with Morocco has also led to the displacement of many, with over 150,000 Sahrawi being forced into refugee camps in neighboring countries. But while just 587,000 people live in this nation that's roughly the size of Wyoming, even less people live in Wyoming. If you want to find out why, there's a video on screen now. Go check it out.